I'm honoured to be the one speaking tonight as we continue through our series on what this church believes. We're going through the basics of what Church at 126 believes about all sorts of topics. So over the last 2 weeks, if you remember 2 weeks ago, we got Bruce to talk to us, and he was talking to us about why does this church exist, and we got to understand why God has placed this church family in this building doing what it is we do together on Sunday and during the week together as well. And then last Sunday we heard from Murray, and we got to learn about who is Jesus and how his death has changed our lives forever. And this week we're talking about faith. What is faith and how do we live it out? I might just move this way a little bit. Will I still be in frame there? So I can see the screen.
Okay.
Alright. Cool. Alright, so when we talk about faith, there's one particular book of the Bible and a particular verse in that book, which is, this book is Hebrews, by the way, that we like to jump to because it gives a really great definition of what faith is. But what I'm wanting to do tonight is not just dive in and focus on one particular verse, but try to go for a flying tour across the book of Hebrews to get an understanding of what the author's trying to tell us about faith throughout the whole book. So this here is the first page of the earliest manuscript of Hebrews that we have. And luckily we do have some where the corner hasn't been eaten off, but there's still a lot that we don't know about this book. We don't know who it was who wrote it. We don't know who they wrote it to or when it was written, but from the book itself and what's contained in it, we do know that it was written to Jewish Christians, and it was written at a time when these Christians were being persecuted, and this persecution was getting worse and worse. So it references prison, mistreatment, and vandalism that the readers of this letter are experiencing. No one's been killed yet, but if you're one of these Christians, then you know a thing or two about suffering for Jesus. So that's just something to bear in mind as we go through this book now. So there's just two key ideas, and that's all there is I want you to take away tonight. So here's number one. Our faith is in the concrete reality of Jesus and what he's done for us. Right on this first page here, this is chapter 1, verse 3. The Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being. I'm going to dig into this idea a lot more in a minute. So let's just jump to the second idea. It's just these two things that I want you to take away today. Saving faith is simply staying loyal to Jesus. Enduring until the finish line like a long-distance runner. A faith that lasts through suffering, sin, or doubt. And that's it. That's all you need to be saved. Here's chapter 3, verse 14 of Hebrews. For if we are faithful to the end, trusting God just as firmly as when we first believed, we will share in all that belongs to Christ. We don't need to be perfect to be saved. We don't need to be without any doubts or second thoughts. And we don't need to have it all together. We just need to hang in there, believing that Jesus is the only way that we can be saved. So now I want to tell you a little bit about my job. So most of you know I'm a structural engineer. I design and assess structures, helping clients have infrastructure that is safe, meets their needs, and doesn't break the bank. So a client will come to us with a description of a building that they want, what function they need, and then what I will do is turn that into technical drawings prescribing what should be built to achieve that. So I cannot give them a building. All I can give them is a piece of paper which is a description of the building. So I'm promising them, if you build this, as I've shown, it'll be everything that you want it to be. But it's not real. It's just a promise. A lot of buildings that I design never actually get built in the end when the client realizes how much it'll cost. And design can change during construction for all sorts of reasons. And once it's built as well, there's all sorts of damage and deterioration that can happen over time. This is some that I've found over the years. So if I'm assessing an existing building and I've got the drawings, I can't actually trust the drawings. The promise isn't good enough. I need to go to the building. I need to whack the concrete with a hammer. Does it sound? I need to chip away at the rust and see how deep it is. Because what matters really is the reality of what's actually there, not the promise of what is going to be there. This here is a technical drawing of the Sky Tower. So it's a promise to the client, here's what you're going to get. But a promise doesn't provide telecommunications or tourism revenue. No, you want the actual thing, and here it is. You can go see it, you can touch it, it's real. So this one is a promise, and this one is real. Okay, so now we are going to jump into Hebrews 11. So how about we find that in our Bibles now, because we'll be spending quite a while in that chapter. So we can yell out the page when they found Hebrews 11, verse 1.
971.
971. Thanks, Tina. Alright, looks like 95% of us have got there. So, this is the first verse of Hebrews. Let's read it together. Faith shows the reality of what we hope for. It's the evidence of things that we cannot see. Our faith is not in a promise. Our faith is in an actual concrete reality. And that's what this word means, the word used for reality here. It's a Greek word called hypostasis, and it means the actual concrete reality of a thing, the evidence and the proof. But what's really cool about this word is it actually ties back to that first verse we looked at before. If you remember this one, Jesus is the exact representation of God. This is actually using the same word, hypostasios. It's got a different suffix in this case. If you want to know more about that, I'm sure you can ask Murray. But it's the same word. It's not a common word. It only comes up 5 times in the Bible. So the author is linking faith, the definition of faith, to this object of faith. Faith is not hope or optimism. It's not waiting and waiting for a promise to come true. Our faith is in an actual concrete reality. And what is that reality? It's Jesus. Jesus came as a human to be proof of who God is. Jesus was God's only son, Prince of the universe, but he gave up all his power and glory to become a natural human. This was a real person in a historical time and place. And he taught something completely new about this kingdom of heaven that could be experienced by anyone who believed in him. Jesus said, I am the only way to know God and go to heaven. There's no other way. And people hated him. He was beaten and mocked and killed in a gruesome way. But he did this willingly because he knew it was all part of God's plan. So Jesus died so that the wrongdoing that separates us from God would be destroyed with him. And although he was killed, Jesus came back to life 3 days later. He proved he has the power to give us all life after death as well. And Jesus is still alive now, although we don't get to see him physically. He's given us an open invitation to know him and be changed by him. And this is what we talked about last week. What I want to focus on this week is the fact that Jesus is an actual concrete reality. When Hebrews was written, there were living people who had known Jesus before and after his death and resurrection. As Christians, we can see Jesus transforming our lives. We can experience God's answers to prayer and his presence with us. It's true we're waiting for Jesus to come back a second time to end all sin and suffering, and then we'll live in the direct presence of God. So there's a part of God's promise that we are still waiting for, but so much of God's promise has already been fulfilled in Jesus. Before Jesus came, God's promise to his people was just a promise. It hadn't come true yet. But we have something better now. This is what the author of Hebrews says. Our faith is not in a promise, but in the concrete reality of Jesus and what he's done for us. We don't just have a promise of how God will change our lives in the future. We get to experience the real thing now. So I'd like us to come back to Hebrews 11 now, because we want to see what faith looks like. And in this chapter we get this section called Heroes of the Faith, which goes through all these people we know about from the Old Testament who were saved because, they demonstrated they were saved through their faith. I've talked about the promise versus the reality. So all these people had faith in the promise because that was all they had. Jesus hadn't come yet. In verse 13 we read, all these people died still believing what God had promised them. They did not receive what was promised, but they saw it all from a distance. We know the object of our faith, which is more than they had, but faith still works the same now as it did back then. So these examples are relevant for us, so let's look at an example. The one I'm going to choose is Abraham and Sarah. So Abraham was the man that God chose to be the father of his own people, the Jewish people. There was just one problem though. Abraham was really old and didn't have any kids. But God promised that through their son, there would be a mighty nation that would be descended. So you can read with me in verse 11 here. It was by faith that even Sarah was able to have a child, though she was barren and was too old. She believed that God would keep his promise. Did Sarah ever doubt? Yeah, if you read Genesis, she burst out laughing when she first heard this promise. But she came around in the end, she believed. What about Abraham? Well, there was this whole mess with a servant girl called Hagar, where he couldn't imagine that he and Sarah could have a child, so he tried to take control of God's plan and he slept with the servant, and it caused a whole lot of trouble. These aren't perfect people. These aren't doubt-free people, but they had the faith that mattered, which was a lasting loyalty and trust in God, that he would keep his promise to them. And he did. Sarah miraculously did give birth to a boy, whom they named Isaac. But while Isaac is still a boy, God tests Abraham. He says to Abraham, and this is in Genesis chapter 22, take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you. How can this be? Isaac is the only way God's promise could come true. But now God's asking Abraham to kill Isaac. You've got to wonder what Abraham's thinking. He couldn't have known how this would turn out, but he did believe that God would deliver on his promise. He knew God would do something to keep his promise. And this is what we read in Hebrews if we go to verse 17 now. It was by faith that Abraham offered Isaac as a sacrifice when God was testing him. Abraham, who had received God's promises, was ready to sacrifice his only son, Isaac, even though God had told him, Isaac is the son through whom your descendants will be counted. What God was asking made no sense, but Abraham believed that God would somehow keep his promise, because he knew God to be a good and trustworthy God. So we read in Genesis 22 again, as Abraham and Isaac near the end of their journey, they leave servants behind, and Abraham says to them, stay here with the donkeys while I and the boy go over there. We will worship and then we will come back to you. Notice here that he's using we will worship and then we will come back to you. So I think Abraham really truly believed they would both return somehow. And the writer of Hebrews thinks this as well. So if we go on to verse 19 now, Abraham reasoned that if Isaac died, God was able to bring him back to life again. And in a sense, Abraham did receive his son back from the dead, because as we know, at the last moment, as Abraham took up a knife, God stops him and provides a sheep to be the sacrifice instead of Isaac. Abraham gets his son back, whom he had given up for dead, and God keeps the promise. So here we have an example of someone who has a saving faith. Did Abraham have doubts? Yes, definitely. He didn't understand what God was doing. How could he? And was Abraham perfect? No, he definitely was not. He slept with a servant girl. We know he lied about Sarah being his sister on 2 different occasions. He doubted, he failed sometimes, but he believed in the promise. And that was the only thing that mattered, the one thing that mattered. So we come back to this key theme. Faith doesn't mean we are always doubt-free or sinless. Saving faith is simply staying loyal to Jesus. And in your own time, you can go through all the examples in Hebrews 11, because we only have time for one today, but there's heaps of them there. And so many of them doubt. There's Gideon, who needs miracle after miracle from God before he's willing to do something courageous that God's telling him to do. So many sin. Look at King David, who slept with the wife of one of his finest soldiers and then had the man killed to cover up his own sin. These are uncertain, selfish people at times. But what is true for all these people is that they never stopped believing in God. They deal with their doubts and took action at last. And they were sorry for the wicked things they did, and they changed their ways. Doubts and sin, these are realities of life for all of us. What matters is how we respond to these issues. We can bring them to God. We can share them with Christians we trust and get prayer or encouragement or advice or practical help. And if this is what we do, then we're on track to stay loyal with Jesus. Or we can choose to isolate ourselves from God and keep these issues secret from our church family. If we keep this up, we risk losing our faith and abandoning our loyalty to Jesus. But it wasn't the sin that did that. It was how we chose to react to it. Doubt and sin aren't what takes away faith. What Hebrews makes clear is that saving faith is simply an enduring loyalty to Jesus. It's believing that because Jesus died for us, God is satisfied with us. It's not being perfect. It's confidence that Jesus loves us and that his death takes away the punishment we deserve. Let me put it another way. It's not about how much faith you have. It's about who your faith is in. So say you sell something on Trade Me for $20 and a guy turns up. Maybe he looks like me, maybe he doesn't, and he offers you this as payment for what he bought on Trade Me. Do you accept this payment? You should not accept this payment. Because how do you know Reserve Bank of David's going to honour the value of this? You don't. Well, okay, says the guy. Fine, I'll give you more then. $2 million. There you go. What about now? Are you going to accept this as payment? No, it's not worth anything, is it? It doesn't matter how much cash he's offering if the currency isn't trustworthy. In the same way, it doesn't matter how much faith you have. What matters is how trustworthy the object of your faith is. Jesus is the concrete reality. Jesus is trustworthy. Jesus is able to save us. And thanks to him, we have something even better than what Abraham was looking forward to. The writers of Hebrews says this: all these people earned a good reputation because of their faith, yet none of them received all that God had promised. For God had something better in mind for us, so that they would not reach perfection without us. These heroes of the faith, they're brothers and sisters of ours. God has something better in mind for all of us who have faith in him. These heroes of the Old Testament and you lot are actually having the same inheritance, and Christ will be completing our salvation alongside their salvation. To receive what God has in mind for us, we simply need to believe in him and to continue to believe in him. This is what Hebrews encourages readers in again and again. Remember, these are Christians suffering because of what they believe. But Hebrews says, hang in there, stay true, keep the faith. It will all be worth it in the end. Here's some verses to back this up. I'm already there. Which one is this? Yes, the first one. But we are not like those who turn away from God to their own destruction. We are the faithful ones whose souls will be saved. And here's another one. For if we are faithful to the end, trusting God just as firmly as when we first believed, we will share in all that belongs to Christ. Faith isn't great deeds where you hold a staff in the air and do some wondrous miracle. Sure, that can be the result of faith. But faith is just trusting God and belief that Jesus is the only way. Faith is Peter when he says, where else can we go? Jesus, you are the way to life. There is no other way. Faith is me kicking my porn habit. Faith isn't the righteousness I gained. No, God grants us righteousness after faith. Faith was when I said, God, I know that your way leads to life and the way I'm on leads to death. And I'm deciding to do whatever it takes because following you matters more than anything. Jesus is the only way. Consider Jesus the author and perfecter of our faith. As he prayed in the garden alone the night before he was killed, God, is there any other way? I don't want to do this. Is there any other way? But if there's not, I'm willing to suffer because I trust you and I believe your plan is good. That's what faith looks like. Faith is trusting in God no matter what. Never turning from God, however hard it feels. So we're nearing the end now. I just want to regroup and go back over these two big ideas about faith in Hebrews. So, one, our faith is in the concrete reality of Jesus. We aren't just hoping. We aren't believing blindly. Jesus has come and Jesus has saved us. And we can experience this new life and friendship with God. It's real and it's now. And the second point, saving faith, is simply staying loyal to Jesus. It's not working miracles. It's not never doubting. It's not never sinning. It's simply keeping on believing that Jesus is the way to be saved. I'm not saying it's easy, by the way. Simple and easy aren't the same thing. But that's where church family comes in. So I'm going to leave you with one last verse from Hebrews, which I'd like us to read together now. Let us think of ways to motivate one another to acts of love and good works. And let us not neglect our meeting together as some people do, but encourage one another, especially now that the day of his return is drawing near. So this verse isn't about becoming our best self. Remember who it's written to. It's a persecuted church that is just hanging in there. I believe in this context, this verse is about the role of church family in helping each other to stay loyal to Jesus. How we can help each other to keep going no matter what. So I think we've heard enough from me. So what I'd ask now is that we use this verse as inspiration at our tables and we answer this question together. How can we help one another to stay loyal to Jesus? And you could be discussing what this verse is saying about that, or what would be really cool is if you have some stories about when Christians have helped you stay loyal to Jesus, and you can share the story of that in your life. So let's please discuss this question at our tables. Thank you.